this atmosphere is incredible. I just really wanted to be a part of that group with the players and the staff and what the club stands for. I think it's amazing.
Those were Naomi Girma's first words officially as a Blue. I'm Tamerra Griffin, and you are listening to a special emergency edition of Full Time with Meg Linehan, where we are going to be diving deep into the details and the specifics of this historic, record-breaking $1.1 million transfer of Naomi Girma from the San Diego Wave to Chelsea Women. And of course, I cannot do this alone. I am joined, as always, by my co-host, Meg Linehan. Meg! History. We're here. How are you doing?
Good.
You've been busy.
It has been a week. It's going to be another week of still reporting around this deal. Obviously, this is, I think, the big story that so many of us who cover the sport have been waiting for, that first $1 million transfer. It is kind of amusing to me of like, we've all decided that it's $1 million and not 1 million pounds that is going to be the threshold that we care about. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, there's always that tension between units of measurement, money included. But it's Naomi, so I think it makes sense for it to be dollars, right?
100%.
Before we go any further, let's set the scene by kicking it out to Jessy Parker Humphreys, who covers the WSL for The Athletic and was at Stamford Bridge when Naomi was first introduced to the Chelsea crowd.
Hi, it's Jessy Parker Humphreys outside a pretty rainy Stamford Bridge. Chelsea have just beaten Arsenal 1-0, puts 9 points clear at the top of the WSL. But really, everything today was about one woman who wasn't on the pitch. Chelsea unveiling Naomi Girma, their world record signing just before kickoff. It was very cool the way they did it. They had a video of her walking down the tunnel, and then it switched to her actually walking down the tunnel, coming out in front of a record-breaking crowd at Stamford Bridge. A huge moment for Chelsea, and it kind of felt like when the game kicked off especially that there was so much energy in the team as the result of signing Girma. Obviously, a massive deal for Chelsea to have done. I think not only the excitement of having a player like Girma, her quality, but also that sense that they've beaten off other teams to get her. You know, they've beaten off an offer from Lyon, an interest from Arsenal, and we know Chelsea will spend money. That's what they're like as a club. And also just the fact that the growth of women's football since Chelsea signed Kerr means that the hype gets bigger and bigger every year as more and more people come into the game. So Girma definitely feels up there. She's going to be a star at the club. You know, her presence, obviously, as a US women's national team player, we know how exciting those kind of players are seen in world global football. And you know, Chelsea got an American ownership, which I think increases their interest in those sort of brand links there. But yeah, Chelsea are a team full of stars, and it will be interesting as well, I think, to see how Girma fits into that world, fits into the WSL. You know, whether there might be some period of adjustment. It'll be interesting to see. That's all what we've got coming to find out. But a very exciting moment and day to day, and if you're a Chelsea fan right now, I think you're feeling pretty smug.
Tamerra, can we also talk about, you must have been asleep when this happened, because I think a lot of us were expecting it maybe at halftime or after the game, and they were like, no, there's no need to wait. We've got Naomi Girma here. We're going to do it before this big game against Arsenal. Like, it was so early for the US.
It was so early. And I had earlier in the week, I looked at that 4:30 a.m. kickoff for West Coast time and said, absolutely not. I had a great evening the night before. I did a face mask. There was a lot of dim lighting. I was super chill. I was going to enjoy my Sunday morning rest. But you know, West Coast people, I think because of this, especially if you're used to following the WSL or any European football, you're used to having these early wake-up times. You're not always used to having early wake-up times where you check your phone and there are scrolls lengths messages about history being made. But, you know, it's not the worst thing in the world. I was happy to wake up to that. Where were you though, Meg?
I was also very much. It was a 7:30 a.m. start for me, and my alarm was set for like 7:55 because I figured that would be safe. Like the game would have started, maybe there would be a goal. There was not a goal, and then I woke up and I was like, "Oh, they sent me the article. It's posted. I'm behind." So yeah, the joys of time zones strike again.
Yeah, and it seems like things like that are just going to continue as we see a lot more cross-pollination, especially between the WSL and the NWSL. But Meg, I know you have been super busy reporting every incremental bit of progress on this deal. And if you, the listeners, need to catch up, please make sure you visit The Athletic and read up on all of the reporting. Not just Meg's, but Michael Cox has a great piece about what it means for this historic transfer deal to be happening for a defender of all people that you can catch up on, and plenty more. So please make sure that you're catching up at The Athletic. Not only there, though, because we also are having a lot of fun on socials. So make sure that you're following us at TA Full-Time on Instagram and TikTok. We post our shows on YouTube as well so that you can stay with us every step of the way, because even though this news was big enough to warrant an emergency episode, there is still so much more to discuss around this historic deal. We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to dive even deeper into the specifics of this Naomi Girma deal. All right, to get into the details of a deal like this, we are joined by Business of Football reporter for The Athletic, Matt Slater. Matt, how are you doing? Thanks for joining us.
I'm fine. How are you?
Doing great. So much to get into, and we're really excited to have you on the show. Before we get into details, let's start with the basics. Can you explain how a club like Chelsea Women could even generate the $1.1 million it took to sign Naomi Girma, beginning with the conversations that probably started with the coach, to the director, to the owner? What is that pipeline typically like? And how do you think they were able to convince ownership to invest this amount in Naomi?
It varies from club to club, right, how these conversations start. But let's assume that Chelsea, and I think it's a safe assumption, are set up like most men's clubs at the moment. Certainly kind of the bigger clubs, right? So there's a recruitment department. There's a director of football, there's a coach, there's a chain of command. So, manager, coach, head coach will say, I need a centre back. The ones I've got aren't good enough. And they'll say to the recruitment boss, who do you like? Who's out there? Who can I have? And they'll go away and they'll have done all their data analysis. They're constantly watching players. They're constantly kind of ranking and ordering players. They're looking at their own team's contract situations. They're always doing sort of forward thinking. I don't need to tell you lot that Naomi's bloody good, right? It wasn't a tough call, was it? So that's the start of it. I'd like one. Who do you like? And then there'll be sort of conversations. It depends how big the recruitment department is. People might say, she's not that good. There's someone over here is much, there'll be, a conversation. It'll then go up. Yeah, we agree on the player. We have an order for a player. We found the player. Right, now can we get her? So then you now start to talk to the CEO, the board. All right, okay, how much is this going to cost us? And then you get into the whole negotiation. So that's the easy bit, really. It's a sort of, I want one, here's a list, can we afford this person? Away we go. Why Chelsea can do this, I think, is more interesting. I think now we get into where women's soccer is. The sport is still pretty much subsidised by the men's side of the game. That's maybe not quite the case in the US, where you actually have some standalone teams, but certainly in the UK, women's football is still loss-making. Now, you could make the same comments about men's football, frankly, but women's football is still loss-making. So Chelsea, for example, they're a like £10 million business, $15 million business in terms of what they generate a year. They made a loss, I think, in the most recent set of accounts, which gets us up to 2023, of about 5 million, something like that. It might be a little bit less. So that's not a terrible loss, but it gives you a sort of sense, right, that this is a club that if it wants to spend, its owners are investing. The shareholders of this company is investing, and it could be in a new training ground, it could be in a whole new load of coaches, it could be upgrading the academy. In this case, it's a player. So that's what's happening here. The assumption, and I think we're going to get into this, is that women's soccer is on the verge of something. It's happening. We're kind of in that phase. There weren't really transfer fees being paid, frankly. Now they are. Now they're significant. And we're going to get, I think, this rapid. But we've already burst through one glass ceiling. It happened in 1979 in the men's game. Trevor Francis. Okay. We'll have our first £2 million player pretty soon in the women's game, I'm fairly sure. So that's where we're at. The owners are saying, let's go for it.
Before we get into, I think, some of that growth piece of women's transfer fees overall, because I totally agree with you. Like, now that 1 million's done, I think we're all immediately going, okay, so 2 million in by the summer, right? But first, let's dig in on Chelsea. Yeah, for Chelsea though, because I think on the men's side, Chelsea's been in the crossfinders a little bit around financial fair play. And, you spoke to right at the moment, the men's team do subsidize the women's teams over in England, which is different for the most part from NWSL. So how much does the men's financial side impact the women's side? Because I think that is maybe kind of different to how folks are thinking about the process here in the US.
Yeah, it's a good question. And I do want to make that point clear that where women's sport is in general, so the basketball, the soccer in the States, you're a good 5 to 10 years further down the road. So Europe is lagging behind, but I think is catching up fast. And in football, we're really going to see that. I think it catch up pretty almost sort of nowish. I think I sort of sense we're sort of in that spell, because the big men's football teams, having previously many of them totally ignored women's football, have massively cottoned on. Chelsea's owners are loaded. They're a big private equity firm. They've made this massive bet on Chelsea. It's a relatively medium-term bet. They spent 2.5 billion on acquiring the shares, acquiring the club, but they made this a promise that they're going to spend another 1.25 billion on stuff. We all assumed it was going to be the stadium. I think the stadium's going to cost way more than that. But on just sort of keeping Chelsea in the manner to which they've become accustomed, i.e. spending. And that's going to see that on both sides. There are no financial fair play considerations on the women's side yet. I think that's probably a good idea at some point. So at the moment, this is a free hit. This is a free hit for Todd Bowley and Bedek Bali at Clear Lake. They are a little bit constrained on the men's side. They haven't breached men's financial fair play, men's PSR. I think we all know, I don't know if you might have discussed it, but they've done it by a series of quite clever accountancy tricks, by selling hotels to themselves. They sold the women's team to themselves, another one, right? So that got them through the last 2 years. They're now also possibly going to sell a stake in the women's team, which I think is really interesting. Mm-hmm. So there's no considerations. There's no restraint required. It really is just a case of, well, how much do we think we really need to spend? Because they're already good. They're already the best team in England. I haven't looked at the results recently, but they're the champions, right? And the sort of next thing for them to do is to win the Champions League, and they've got pretty close, and they've clearly decided, well, we're going to spend and we're going to win the Champions League. I think that from a sort of purely financial point of view, for the amount of money we're talking, £1 million player here, £1 million player there, and we get to be the best team in Europe on the women's side, versus how much does it cost to be the best team in Europe on the men's side? I totally understand why Clear Lake, and this is way more sensible than the money they're investing in the men's team.
I mean, that is going to be really interesting to watch, just in terms of, again, I think we have seen both the pros and cons of the independent model / the MLS / NWSL club over here in the US. And, it's not necessarily better or worse. It's just different. So I think it's very much something we need to be keeping our eyes on. We definitely need to bring you back in. I think, once we hit that $2 million or £2 million number this summer in the next window, I think there's a lot to keep on talking about. But thank you so much for joining us today, Matt. We definitely appreciate it, especially on short notice.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Matt. All right, Meg, now that we've heard from Matt, let's talk about how this affects women's soccer specifically. Can you give us a timeline of events from the beginning of this transfer deal starting until what we witnessed on Sunday?
Yeah, I mean, this apparently has been in the works for a while. Naomi Girma has wanted to move on from the Wave. It sounds like since last spring, it like early into the NWSL season, apparently, and that's coming out of San Diego sources. So we've also already seen that, obviously, with some other players moving on from the Wave, Jaden Shaw, Abby Dahlkemper heading up to BFC. So there was kind of this sense of a few big key players wanting to move on. For Naomi Girma, it does seem like Europe was very much a goal for her, which is not, it shouldn't be surprising for anyone. But obviously transfers are a lot of moving pieces, to say the least. So we had seen for a long time, okay, Chelsea's in the mix, Lyon is in the mix, Arsenal's in the mix. Basically, like any major European team is at least like looking at Naomi Girma and being like, okay, what's the potential price tag? What does she offer the team? But Chelsea had a positional need after Kadisha Buchanan had her ACL injury. So I think there was obviously a need, and knowing that they were already, I think, looking at Naomi Girma, really a marriage here. But obviously there is that kind of lag between when all of the reporting comes out and then the official announcement. Naomi Girma also missed U.S. Soccer's January camp because of a minor calf injury of some kind. We don't know super specifics on that. So, obviously we saw, even when we were recording last week, in terms of people kind of speculating like, well, she's not in camp because she's out in England right now signing that new deal or getting her medical. But she reported to San Diego's first day of training. It sounds like she told her teammates on that first day of training, like, okay, I'm going to head out. I've got this transfer cooking. We'll see you later. So yeah, it has been very much a long journey, but I think there was some fear maybe that like San Diego is dealing her against her will, or this wasn't something that she wanted, but that I have heard nothing, but this was something that she has been looking for basically the better part of a year.
And not to say that the places that a player goes when they have breaks, when they're in the off season, can tell us anything about where they might be interested in. But to the extent that it might, we all have been peeping how much time she'd been spending in Europe, specifically in the UK, sometimes even specifically in London, even when she was still with the Wave, catching up with her bestie, Kat Macario, who is now her co-worker, her work wife, probably. It does very much seem, of course, in hindsight, when we can look at this even more clearly, that this had been building in multiple ways. But I'm glad that you pointed out the full length of this timeline, because I think from the outside, even with the media, it can sometimes feel like there's nothing happening, and then this explosion of activity in news, which is probably how a lot of us were feeling in the past couple of weeks. But to actually lift up the hood and know how long she herself had been planning this gives so much more context to this news. Let's talk about this fee, though, because you're not going to see $1.1 million, Naomi Girma's name, without the word historic, without the phrase record-breaking. This is huge, not just for her, not just for Chelsea, but for women's soccer in general. Can you sort of like capture the magnitude of this moment when it comes specifically to how much Chelsea was willing to pay for her?
Yeah, I think there's, Charlotte last week on the show called it a coup for Chelsea. It was really, we all knew $1 million transfer was going to happen sooner rather than later. So I think there is a lot of sense in that. It is a defender. It is Naomi Girma. I think there's a premium still attached to U.S. women's national team players, especially post-Olympics. Naomi Girma in particular is probably the one who is always going to have the biggest price jump attached to her name after the Olympics. And I also think after that game where she scored 2 goals too, right? She's kind of just been adding to the resume all year, all of 2024. And then it's just the price tag just kind of kept jumping and kept jumping and kept jumping. But I do think that it's going to be really interesting to kind of watch this play out, because what I think the fear has always been, and maybe what Matt Slater was also speaking to a little bit is that sometimes these things happen without the infrastructure truly being built in order to sustain it, right? Like we might get 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And so I don't know if we're going to see like immediately another transfer, or even another, if another U.S. women's national team player goes to Europe in the short term, another $1 million fee. But what I think needs to happen is some other teams kind of need to catch up and realize the investment that needs to be made. And then that's when we're going to see, okay, the $2 million coming in again. Like that's why I kind of think summer transfer, it's going to give people a little more time to adjust, to understand the investment coming around in the sport. And I do think, and we're going to get into this, it's going to give us some bigger questions about the NWSL and how the league is prepared to meet this moment, because generally NWSL has been the ones, like teams like Bay FC or Orlando Pride, right, have been the ones spending money, and so now it's kind of the shoes on the other foot with WSL.
Completely. And I think there's still yet another side through which we can interpret this fee, and it's related comparatively a little bit more superficial, but I still have strong feelings about that Ballon d'Or snub from last season with Naomi. And I can only imagine how the people who were defending the decisions, who maybe were not giving her the necessary flowers that she was due, are feeling in light of this huge deal, because clearly several clubs saw value in her. And yet for her to not even make an appearance on that list, it says a lot about who's paying attention and where they're paying attention. But I can also see that changing now that she is playing in Europe, for better or worse, right?
I mean, I do think that is still kind of the fundamental issue with that award, is that it is a European award. And I do think that there is kind of an inherent bias in a lot of folks who still think, and I mean, I've seen this even in some of the conversations around the fear about the NWSL falling behind. And I think the note that I just keep coming back to is like, Europe is not the only source of talent. Like right at the moment, it might have some of, like, I think it's got the reputation, right? And that honestly is coming more from the men's side than the women's side, at least historically, right? Of just, there is real prestige attached to Champions League. And I think that's totally fair, right? Like, I'm sorry, but the U.S. has nothing that is even remotely close to the prestige of Champions League right now. And that is one of the big things that NWSL has to figure out how it competes with. But at the same time, when you think about Barbara Banda coming into this league, or Temwa Chwenga, all of these players, right? Like, there's real talent outside of Europe. And so there is not necessarily this kind of like panic button of, okay, we're seeing a handful of players go to England or potentially to France, right? That there is the sense of, now we're just kind of starting to see the movement that we should have always been seeing in the women's game, and that we should have expected in the women's game.
I totally agree. I welcome this continued chaos, even for the roller coasters of emotions it might incite from people, particularly San Diego Wave fans. And I know that we are going to have a broader conversation about what this means for the NWSL as a league, but it's worth holding space for San Diego, because in one season, they've lost Alex Morgan, Abby Dahlkemper, Jaden Shaw, and now Naomi. 4 huge gaping holes, not to mention the likes of Amira Ali, who's now headed to Spain as well. This is a huge blow for this club. And we haven't mentioned even ownership, new coaching coming in. It almost feels like to say that they are going to enter a rebuild is not even doing justice to where they're at right now.
Yeah, I mean, they've already been working on a rebuild, right? I mean, I think the writing has been on the wall for San Diego basically all year. And it sounds like, I mean, basically the stuff that's coming out of that side of things too, is that they knew that some of these moves were only a matter of time, right? And so you have Cami Ashton coming in as general manager, which is already one change. You have Idaval coming in as head coach, another change. You have new ownership coming in, another change, right? So there really is a clean break in a lot of ways for San Diego. Obviously, there's a lot of culture things that are still hanging over this team in terms of the lawsuit, in terms of, I mean, just any number of issues. But what I do think is interesting now is that there is going to be money for them to try to figure out. We have seen I feel like every day I've been getting an email about another player that they have signed. So like they have been very active in trying to figure out what this roster is going to look like for 2025. I think it's maybe a little early to figure out how good they're going to look. I mean, the preseason tournament coming up at Coachella could be really interesting in terms of getting that first look of what San Diego Wave is going to look like. But yeah, I mean, rebuild feels like a very inadequate word just because so much has changed. I mean, just like a complete top to bottom overhaul.
Yeah, it doesn't feel adequate. And it also doesn't feel like a word that naturally comes to mind when you think about a club as young as San Diego. No. I mean, build, sure, but rebuild when you're not even, a handful of years old yet, is not typically how the narrative goes for fairly young expansion teams. Definitely we will stay seated. Lots of newness from like the status of the players to the new faces at the club. But on the other end of things, you have teams like the Washington Spirit, you have Lyon. What do those teams have in common? Of course, Michelle Kang. She was outbid in this. I mean, it was looking like Lyon for a minute. And I think especially, it's not just Lyon, but it's Lyon plus Michelle Kang. She does not usually lose things. But I think the fact that she was outbid in this fight for Naomi also is something that we can like glean some meanings from. I mean, to me, it means that one, good news can only stay private for so long. People are, especially business-minded people, are always going to want a piece of the action. But I was sort of surprised by how quickly she started to face legitimate competition when it came to how much she was willing to invest in a player or in a team. What about you, Meg?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it's like wildly surprising that Lyon lost out on Naomi Girma. I think, first of all, Lyon really didn't necessarily have the same need Chelsea did. True. So I think there was incentive for Chelsea to step up and say like, okay, we can knock it up by another, $100,000 or so. But there is maybe the sense of, and again, speaking to Matt's point, right? Like we have seen that kind of stratosphere of top European teams. And really, I think there's only 3, and that's Chelsea, Lyon, Barcelona, right at the moment, right? Of like truly in that upper echelon, like consistently Champions League final appearance, win, whatever it is. And so I think there is kind of like an arms race between those 3 teams. Barcelona has, in general, a very different approach than the other two, right? Like Chelsea and Lyon are kind of that constantly in battle with each other, trying to figure out how to one-up each other. And yeah, I do think it's interesting, but also, I mean, I'm pretty sure Michelle Kang is smart enough to know that like she has shown the way in terms of investment, right? And it is kind of funny too of just the history going back to the Washington Spirit of Todd Boehly also being linked in the sale process of the Washington Spirit, which Michelle eventually won. There is some history there too.
That's true, and nothing adds texture and tension to all of this than history. Because with history, you have potential beef, you have chips on shoulders, and you never know when or where those things might crop back up. But it definitely added to the narrative that it wasn't just Chelsea and Arsenal, for example, but the fact that Lyon was in the mix too is always going to liven things up a bit. So we need to talk about the NWSL, what this means for the NWSL. Do we need to be nervous, excited, some combination of both, that arguably one of the best, not just defenders in the world, but one of the best players in the world is now departing the league?
I mean, I feel like this conversation happens literally any time a U.S. women's national team. Like, I remember it with Megan Rapinoe. I remember it with Alex Morgan, the Sam Ewis and Rose Lavelle going to Europe conversation, right, of whoever kind of the big name is. What I do think is different in this case is just Naomi is 24 years old. It is a long-term deal, right, that will keep her there. This is not like I'm going to go over to Europe before, like, this is the time in the cycle where you would kind of expect people to move because there's no like major competition for the U.S. women's national team this year. But what I do think is with Emma Hayes, first of all, like there's obviously the understanding of European football and what it might offer. And I think this kind of sense of like the NWSL is a good and useful thing for the U.S. women's national team, but is not the only good and useful thing. And again, I've just fundamentally believed that better competition is only going to force the NWSL to be better and to spend more money and to invest more and to be more competitive. Like they have to be forced into it. That's what we have seen, right? And so you have the collective bargaining agreement. I think we'll get into this in the next section, but like the rules are going to be really interesting to watch here for the NWSL because they just can't afford right now to be MLS 2.0. Like that to me is the biggest takeaway from this is the league cannot look at MLS and be like, that's the league that we have to copy right now. You have to be ambitious. You have to want to like be in the same room as the Chelseas, the Lyons, the Barcelonas as a league. And that's maybe a different conversation than a lot of other folks are having right now. So it's going to be really interesting. But like Tamerra, I mean, we've seen transfer fees for players incoming into this league. Are you like, I just feel like I got so many messages where everybody was like, I'm so worried about the NWSL.
Yeah, I mean, I agree that this conversation comes up every time a big name departs for Europe. I think that as the NWSL continues to grow and professionalize itself as a league, I can understand how the shock almost becomes a little bit more fraught because the NWSL is giving players more and more reasons to want to stay at the same time. And then Naomi, and I'm not even talking about what she contributes on the field, but as a full player, is generational in that sense. It's rare that you get someone with the off-field leadership, the maturity, and the on-field product that she has. And so there are many reasons for people to be freaking out right now. There always have. But to your point, the NWSL is showing its viability with these record fees that we saw even leading up to this. The $865,000 for Rachel Kundananji to BFC, the $765,000 for Barbara Bandit to the Orlando Pride. And seeing what those two players contributed just this season in both of their first seasons, I think tells you a lot about what we can continue to expect of this league moving forward. I'm excited about it. I think I am definitely in the chaotic good quadrant of things right now.
Yep.
And that sort of speaks to the point that you made that the more these record-breaking transfer fees happen, it's only going to increase the competition. Now there are a lot of question marks around parity in the league. That will be an ongoing conversation on this podcast and elsewhere. But even having to reckon with that is only ultimately, I think, going to lead to growth for the league. So I still see it as a good thing. Plenty of space for us to feel our feelings about players' movements. But ultimately, I think it's heading us in the right direction.
Yeah, I mean, I think the NWSL has to be forced into like proving if it wants to be the best league in the world and it wants to say it's the best league in the world, then you have to prove it, right? And so part of that is going to be salaries, part of that is going to be splashing out cash for transfer fees, whatever it is. If you want to bring in talent, if you want to retain talent, if you want to retain US players, you've got to make it worth it for them. And so, yeah, I don't mind the NWSL getting pushed here because I think they do need to be pushed.
Totally agree. Let's take a quick break, and then we are going to get into the many, many listener questions that you guys had as a result of this deal. All right, we have reached what I will call the express mailbag portion of the show. First of all, thank you to everyone who woke up ready, clearly was caffeinated, and was prepared to pepper us with so many questions about this transfer deal. We really appreciate all of the engagement. We appreciate the curiosity. We're going to try and get through as many of them as we can. There were quite a bit, and we sort of have a system because a lot of people were asking similar things, right, Meg?
Yeah, there's definitely like 3 themes across the board. I think we've kind of addressed some of them around like there was a lot of worry, understandable, again, around where the NWSL was. I think we've kind of addressed that in the previous section, so we can set that one aside. But a lot of the questions really did have to do with money, which I think makes sense. So I almost want to start us off with like, how does a transfer fee work? And
Yes.
does Naomi Girma see any of this $1.1 million? No, she does not. And what is her salary? And so, like, first, let's kind of understand that a transfer fee is going to be between Chelsea and the San Diego Wave. So it has nothing to do with Naomi Girma's contract. It is like just straight up like this is what we are basically bribing you with in order for us to sign Naomi Girma to a new contract for Chelsea. Now the next part of that is, what is Naomi Girma going to make at Chelsea, which unfortunately I think may be a giant mystery for all of time.
All of time. I mean, it's a natural question to want to ask when you see numbers like 1.1 million and when the player is one of the best in the world. But this opacity has been an ongoing challenge, especially for journalists who cover this game. I do wonder, though, Meg, with that, do you see that changing? With Matt, we were talking about the likelihood that we will soon see a $2 million transfer record fee broken. And the way I see it, the more that continues to happen, the more these like glass ceilings are being shattered, the more questions we're going to have. And the more frequently we ask those questions, it's possible that that could translate into pressure that at least starts to poke holes into some of this opacity, right? Has to.
I would love to think that. I mean, I do. What's so fascinating too is that because of the CBA on the U.S. women's national team side, right, with U.S. soccer, we have a lot of the numbers around like what players get paid, right? And so I think there is kind of an understanding generally of what the ceiling is for players in terms of you know, what a camp earns them, what a win earns them against whatever opponent it is, whatever. Like you can kind of have a sense of, okay, this player is going to end up making this much from national team obligations. Whereas again, and if you've listened to this podcast, you've heard us kind of say this before, the NWSL, like we don't know salary cap info, we don't know salary info unless players kind of volunteer, which sometimes happens, sometimes does not. Obviously, we know a few kind of salaries depending on who wants to be chatty. On the UK side, it really, we didn't know what Naomi Girma made in San Diego. I don't know if we're going to ever find out what she's making at Chelsea. I have hit a wall on that front. So it is really interesting I think a lot of people are really struggling to be like, okay, so she's worth 1.1 million in a transfer fee. Like clearly she's going to get paid. And I do think she's very much going to get paid, but the game is not in that place yet where the transparency is there. And obviously, like, I have been dealing with this frustration for well over a decade, but now I do kind of wonder if, like, people are going to kind of be a little more, like, let this radicalize you in terms of demanding more information from these leagues. And, I mean, that's not just for the NWSL either.
Absolutely. I mean, we hear in so many other industries how salary transparency is used as a mechanism for pay equity. Of course, there is more context about what that means for women's sports, what it means for the NWSL specifically, but absolutely agree. Please be radicalized if you're listening to this. Any other themes that we need to address before we get into the specific questions, Meg? Yeah,
again, like, I think another money one, too, is just the NWSL salary cap rules. So first of all, again, we don't have the full text of the new CBA between the league and the Players Association. So we're kind of dealing with the very limited amount of information that we got out of that first press release of the year, which basically said there's this net limit of transfer fees for NWSL clubs of $500,000. And then after that, you get a salary cap hit. And so I will tell you, just based on the full back and forth of about 48 hours of all of us trying to like understand how this was worded versus what it actually means, generally that rule, like, I think you have to think of it it's almost an incentive. So that way, again, when for NWSL, parity is still the number one kind of like thing that this league loves. Mm-hmm. And so that rule of you kind of get dinged if you're going out and spending more than $500K to acquire players. It's kind of trying to prevent a super team from being assembled, / like especially like you're just sucking up all the international talent, right? And so I think you have to think about that as like money is going out, players are coming in. Whereas for Naomi Girma's case, there's not going to be any penalty for San Diego Wave in terms of 1.1 million potentially coming in one fell swoop. And so, because there's so many questions, especially on like that day one of reporting the news, everybody being like, well, they're going to get hurt on their salary. And it's like, no, they're not. You've got to think about like money being spent on players coming in. So hopefully that explains it. I hope once we get the actual CBA, we can kind of like get the real language behind it. So that way it makes a little more sense for people. But like, league rules are always one of the dumbest things to try to have to explain, because people who don't speak in normal English language are the ones writing.
How convenient.
So,
I mean,
I think that's
hard...
like the other big kind of like logistical question. And then I think it gets into like, when will she play?
Mm-hmm. Right. And I will say that it's hard to imagine we won't have an episode about the CBA when we are able to read it. But in the meantime, I do want to recommend past episodes of this podcast where we have gotten into CBA conversations with players like Brianna Pinto. Just last week, we recorded an episode. Yes, it was about the elimination of the NWSL draft, but it does include conversations with agents, general managers, new players to the NWSL, where we get into some of the nitty gritty, at least when it comes to contracts. So in the meantime, there are some materials that you can sort of familiarize yourself with between now and whenever the CBA is made public.
Yeah, 100%. And then I do think like, yeah, the final theme of when will she play? I mean, again, Naomi Girma does legitimately have a minor calf injury. And the sense I get in terms of talking to people, and I know Sonia Bonpastor, the head coach of Chelsea, she was not wildly specific in her press conference following the win against Arsenal, but I do think that there is the sense of like, there is no need to rush her. Champions League play doesn't really kick back up again until March. So they have a couple weeks to play with here, and they want peak Naomi Girma, and there does not seem to be a need, especially where Chelsea is on the table right now, to want to force that issue.
Exactly. I was just thinking about, of course, the timing of this announcement when it was made official, right before this major, essentially season deciding game for Chelsea. They beat Arsenal. They are cruising to a league title. They are comfortable at their table in Champions League. And it does beg the question of, one, it's great when you think about the alleviation of pressure that might create for Naomi. They're not just going to be like breathing down her neck as she works on this as she works on this injury to get back onto the field. But that's a good way to sort of segue into what the picture sort of looks like for her in terms of what she can achieve with Chelsea this year. I mean, they are hungry for a Champions League title and are pretty poised to get one given the momentum that they have. It's hard to imagine her not being anything other than like a crucial added piece to maybe secure that, right?
I mean, Barcelona, right? Like that's Barcelona, Lyon. Like those are the two major other teams that I think Chelsea is looking at and saying, okay, how do we counteract? But it is going to be really interesting to watch because, again, yes, I do think Chelsea has a little bit of time here. They've got some breathing room on the table, but there is a sense of, again, this kind of dedicated ambition from this team. And yeah, I think it will be really interesting. Emma Hayes has not really, I believe, as of the time of recording, said anything directly about Naomi Girma going to Chelsea. She did post that she was trying to watch Chelsea Arsenal from like a children's party and that she was challenged by it. But one of the questions that we did get was the implications of a USA captain playing in WSL. Did Emma Hayes have anything to do with it? First of all, Naomi Girma not team captain yet, though the team captain, Lindsay Heaps now, which I still have to adjust to. Lindsay Horan in Lyon, right? And so, yeah, I do think that the U.S. is obviously shifting slightly European. But I do, again, Emma Hayes, I'm sure did not have any sort of like, yeah, you should go to Chelsea, sit down with Naomi Girma. I think she knows that she can't necessarily medal, but clearly would be a resource, right?
Has to be. I mean, I think a lot about, and you hear players say this all the time about, you know, the club culture, the legacy of winning that drew Naomi to Chelsea specifically. But Chelsea has been building something really special. And of course, you have to credit Emma Hayes with a lot of that, just given her tenure at the club before she became U.S. Women's National Team head coach. But when you also think about Naomi herself, how young she is, how long of a career she has ahead of her, how early she has already established herself as a leader. You look at players like Millie Bright that she's now going to be able to be playing alongside and learning from, who herself has a long tenure as a leader at a big club. On top of what it means for her to be playing again with Kat Macario, with Mia Fishel when she gets back from injury, competing, you know, maybe alongside Millie Bright and Khadijah.
In training against Sam Kerr when she gets back from her injury.
Myra, like, I think about how much she stands to grow with this club, not just in terms of the competition, but as you said, even just training with this team. And it sort of clears up the questions about why and when she made this move. And I think overall, this is only going to push women's soccer forward. I mean, we're seeing how much more international the NWSL is getting too. So it's not just that US-based players are going to Europe, it's that players from all over the world are increasingly being attracted to the NWSL. So I think really what's happening is a multi-directional normalization of these movements because everyone wants to invest more in the women's game.
Yeah. All right. Hopefully they answered your question of entanglements on Instagram. I do feel like we obviously went much bigger picture, but I do think, yeah, totally agree with everything you just said, Tamerra. It is, everybody's going everywhere, and we're just in a little bit of a brave new world right now.
There you go. I mean, a lot of these questions, to an extent, will always remain to be seen. We will all be collectively holding our breath for Naomi's Chelsea debut. And until then, there are so many questions that remain. I mean, this has been, and I think will increasingly become, the most exciting and like chaotic off seasons in the NWSL because of movements like this. I mean, we didn't even talk about Caroline making her debut for Man City. And I think to have stars that begin their careers in the NWSL and then go abroad, it's going to make people more interested in where they're going as well. So I personally have dreams of us all having this like omnivorous interest in all women's professional clubs all over the world. But moves like this, I think, really do sort of pave the way for this cross interest, which it just means the party is going to be nonstop. This doesn't even feel like an off season because of how much has been going on, Meg.
I very much agree. I think we all got like, oh, we didn't even get a week off. Like we got Christmas off and that was about it.
And that already feels like forever ago. And if you still can't get enough, if you're a fellow sicko, if you want more stories and more coverage of women's sports, this is just a gentle reminder that Yahoo Sports and The Athletic are in a partnership to provide free, best-in-class coverage of women's sports. So make sure that you check out the hub where you can find soccer stories, basketball stories, hockey stories, and everything in between. sports.yahoo.com/women-sports. You'll find it all there. Meg, it's been a privilege to make history with you on this emergency. I mean, this was our first emergency pod. So many things going into the memory book. My name is Tamerra Griffin. I'm alongside Meg Linehan, and you have been listening to Full Time with Meg Linehan, the emergency episode edition. You can catch me working my heart rate back down to normal after this crazy early start to the day on Blue Sky and Instagram.
And you can also find me on Instagram if you want to see photos from my dog's 15th birthday party. They're now up on Instagram. Blue Sky for all the news, all that kind of fun stuff. You can also email us at fulltime@theathletic.com. Again, we will, I'm sure, more questions, more comments about Naomi Girma moving over, send them over to us.
This show is not possible without podcast producer Thea Lloyd Hughes, video producer Leah Griffin, and executive producer Emily Olson. Thank you so much for listening to us, and we will be back with you at our regular scheduled programming on Thursday.